Before I get going, I just thought I don't often do this, but if you are a reader and you want a helpful book to go deeper into Acts, to kind of go as a companion guide as you read through, Tom Wright's relatively new book called The Challenge of Acts, I found really helpful. If you're a reader, I recommend it. If you're like, I haven't read a book in a couple of years, maybe don't start with this guy. I don't know. I don't know what to suggest you if you haven't, but it's good. It's good that you want to read, but maybe don't start here. If you're not a keen reader, might turn you off even more. But it's a really helpful book, and I found it really useful as I studied and looked through Acts. Acts is a book, and I'm aware of this as I've spoken to a few of you so far this morning. Like, Acts is a book that is like it's a bit of a dearly loved book among people. And immediately, when you say you're going to preach through the book of Acts in one morning, that creates a sense of expectation on what you're about to hear. And so I don't know if what I'm about to tell you in the next 20 minutes is going to be a disappointment to you, or if you think I'm going to do a good job. But I can't do this book justice in the next 20 minutes, so go easy on me, number one. But you can summarize Acts in so many different ways. Acts is a book telling the story of how God's kingdom comes through Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, and through the church. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it's it's the second part in a two-part work by the gospel writer Luke that goes together with his gospel that tells the story of how the gospel of Jesus Christ is formed, and Jesus comes from the margins right into the city of Jerusalem, and then Acts picks up in Jerusalem, and then how the gospel, how the good news of Jesus Christ spreads out from those places, from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You could look at it like that. You could chop it up and say, actually, it's a story of King Jesus' new kingdom, his new temple, a new witness to the world, and a new family of God. You could describe it like that. It's a book that's marked by loads and loads of different features as well. And some of you would be thinking, hey, when I read the book of Acts, I get really inspired about needing to love and care for the poor. And that would be correct. That would be a great thing to pick up from the book of Acts. Some of you might be, maybe the more pessimistic among us might say, actually, I love the fact that it's really real about persecution that comes as Christians. And the fact that when the gospel's going forward, there's always opposition and always things that we need to be aware that come back to us. And you'd be correct. And we see that right now, right? In areas of the world that are still persecuted, generally all for Christian faith. You look at what's happened in the Ukraine, for example. Actually, God has used that situation for some good. We're linked in as a movement of churches with a guy called Andrei Bondarenko. He was a kind of apostolic leader in Ukraine. And since the conflict began, actually kind of in the middle of the last decade rather than in the last couple of years, but he was displaced. But actually what God's been able to use him to do is see churches planted right across Europe. And so you think, actually, well, he might say, oh, I wish I'd never had this episode with the Russians really go to the level it has done. And God's saying, but I'm using it for good. It's through persecution that the gospel goes to the ends of the earth. And we see that in Acts. It's persecution that takes the Christians out of the city of Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria. It's persecution that sees them go right out even further. You might be looking at the book of Acts actually through a bit more of a kind of Judeo-Christian lens and saying, actually, this is all about God's extended mission to his people, to Israel. We don't just stop reading the Old Testament and forget about Israel. Actually, Acts is also about his ongoing mission to Israel as well as their Messiah. And then some other people read the book of Acts and they say, actually, it's about that, but it's also about God's mission to the nations of the world, and about the fact that God is king over all things, and that's always been his eternal intention. And so you can see my problem, can't you, when I sit with my open notebook at the start of Acts and think, okay, I've got 18 minutes, what am I going to talk about this morning? And I felt just led, as in my studies, to zoom in on Acts 17. And Acts 17 is a moment in the story where Paul has already become Paul. He used to be Saul before he was a Christian, and he's now in his kind of church planting mission phase. He's on a journey into the rest of the world. He's on a journey into the Gentile parts of the world, the non-Jewish parts of the world, to preach the good news about Jesus, to see churches established, to see the kingdom come, and then to go on and do it all over again in new places. And in Acts 17, Paul is in Athens. Who's been on holiday to Greece? Has anyone actually ever been to Athens? Anyone been to the place where to the areas where Paul preached around Mars Hill? Anyone? No? Oh, yeah, cool. So this is I think so. This is a place that back in Paul's day was sort of the high court. It's a place called the Areopagus, and it's a place in Greek culture where it was basically the highest court. Some people would see it as kind of like a place where philosophical debates were had. That is kind of true, but it was also a court. It was also where people got sent for public trial if they were causing problems or if they had some issues that needed sorting out. And Paul is charged by the local people with preaching foreign gods. So they say, hey, in our culture we have these gods, and boy did they have some gods. They had lots of them. And Paul is preaching about a new kind of God. He keeps preaching about this Jesus character, and then we think he's also preaching about someone called anastasis, which is basically the word that Paul uses for resurrection. They think when he's talking about Jesus and the resurrection, he's talking about two different gods. And actually, of course, Paul is saying, no, King Jesus has been resurrected, and therefore this is why this new faith, this new God on the scene in your culture is going to change everything. And the people of Athens are suspicious. They've heard rumors of this church emerging in other places and the trouble that it's caused. The Christians are quite mysterious people. They claim to worship a king, and yet they're not trying to kind of take over cities in a military way. They're not trying to say that their king needs to be put on a physical throne in the city, and that they don't come with an army. They come in kind of house churches, and they do this. They pray behind closed doors, and things start to happen. But they also hear about stuff that's happened in other cities where Paul's preached, and they hear about the riots in Ephesus. They hear about all the miracles and all the things, and they're going, I'm not sure we want any of this in our city. And they've also heard that the reason why these clashes happen is because they refuse to worship idols. And that typically has been a thing that only the Jewish people do. They have a special exemption that allows them not to worship idols in the kind of Roman Empire. And the Christians are trying to get in on that. And they're trying to say, hey, yeah, we don't worship any of these idols either. We worship this one true God, this Jesus King who's been resurrected. And so it tells us at the beginning of Acts 17, Paul arrives in Athens, and he's actually waiting for his friends Silas and Timothy to come and join him. But while he's there, while he's waiting, something begins to trouble him. He looks around the city, and he is so concerned by the number of idols that they worship. And Paul, if you read, as you read through Acts, Paul's a bit of a troublemaker for the gospel. Like he doesn't pull his punches. He's not worried about what people think of him. He's just, if I see a problem, I'm going to call it out. And so he starts to preach about Jesus. He can't help himself, and that gets him in trouble with these authorities. That's what gets him hauled before the Areopagus, this court, on this charge of preaching foreign divinities. And what we're going to read through is one of Paul's most famous speeches, where he's being asked to give a defense for his faith in Jesus. He's being asked to explain this charge of preaching foreign divinities. And as the opportunistic gospel preacher he is, he says, right, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity then. Here's my defense in the court. And we're going to read that in a moment. But why I think this is important for us to focus, you might be thinking, okay, Thomas, it's a lovely history lesson. Why does this matter? Why have you picked this? Well, I want to talk about the Holy Spirit. I want to talk about the church. I've picked this because I think the culture that Paul engages in actually has quite a lot of similarities to our own. And so when we read the book of Acts, we can look at all the different ways in which culture is reached, or different cities are reached and different places are reached. And we're kind of looking for touch points, aren't we? We're looking for how does this help me with my life? How does this help me with the context that we find ourselves in? And I think this is a moment that can really, really help us. Our cultures are quite similar. The Athenian culture is full of really, really spiritual people. So as Paul's already identified, they worship loads of idols. There's things in homes, there's things in the public square, and there's all sorts of things going on. There's a lot of spiritual people. But then there's also lots of kind of stoic, philosophical academics who seem to have graduated from the idea of gods or God or spiritual stuff, and they're very logical and they're very reasonable thinkers. And so this society is this blend of both of these kinds of people, very much like ours. And Paul's message gives us these helpful truths and touch points that I think can help us engage with a similar kind of culture, engage with a culture like ours, who really, like our community is in desperate need of Jesus, isn't it? The people around us in our lives are in desperate need of Jesus. And what we need to be able to do is help them see that actually, rather than Christianity, rather than Jesus being this kind of dangerous virus that they mustn't catch or get infected by, actually we need to help them see that no, Jesus is the key to unlocking life. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And so we encounter Jesus and we unlock what we're really all about, what we're really here for. So I'm going to rattle through this and read this, and then we will unpack it together. Acts chapter 17, I'm going to read from verse 16 to 32. So, while Paul was waiting for them, that's Silas and Timothy, his friends, in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. He went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and he spoke daily in the public square to all who happened to be there. So Paul's tactic when he arrives in a new place, he always starts in the synagogue. He always starts with the Jews, always starts with God's people, and says, I'm going to try you first, I'm going to make sure you get the message, and often they don't. And then he'll preach in there until he gets in trouble and gets kicked out, and then he'll preach to whoever else in the city, and then he leaves. He also then had a debate with some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. When he told them about Jesus and his resurrection, they said, what's this babbler trying to say with these strange ideas he's picked up? He seems to be preaching about some foreign gods. Then they took him to the high council of the city. Come and tell us about this new teaching, they said. You are saying some rather strange things, and we want to know what it's all about. It should be explained that all the Athenians, as well as the foreigners in Athens, seem to spend all their time discussing the latest ideas. Can you imagine if they all had Facebook like we do now? So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I noticed that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm telling you about. He's the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has none. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From one man he created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have even said, we are his offspring. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. God overlooked people's ignorance about these things in earlier times, but now he commands everyone everywhere to repent of their sins and turn to him. For he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed, and he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. When they heard Paul about the resurrection of the dead, some laughed in contempt, but others said, we want to hear more about this later. That ended Paul's discussion with them, but some joined him and became believers. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the council, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So as often with Paul's gospel messages, some believe, some recognize the truth in what he's saying, and I love just the kind of little array of different people, like one of the philosophers, one of the members of the council, a woman who we're suddenly introduced to who gets named because she's a new disciple of Jesus, which is very exciting. Like all of these different things, you just go, wow. But some said, oh, I want to talk about this later, but I've just got to go and watch the 3 o'clock kickoff, or I've got to just go and do some jobs, or actually, I'm not interested at all, you're a joker. It's the different responses we get when we preach the truth about Jesus. So what I'd love to do, hopefully quickly, but effectively, is look through 3 things. I want to look at the importance of this altar to the unknown God that Paul picks out as the touch point to reaching that culture. I want us then to look at how worshipping idols hasn't really stopped, even though we don't necessarily have loads of shrines in our culture like they did, and that the God we're all looking for is found in Jesus. So, as Paul said, there's this altar in the middle of the city. So imagine hundreds of different statues and altars and different idols, basically, to all sorts of different things. But then somewhere in the middle is this altar to the unknown God. Now there's kind of novels that try and explore the root of this. Essentially, it's there as a massive question mark in Greek culture. They're saying, oh, we worship the God of this, the God of that, the God of the weather, the God of the sun, the God of food, the God of the harvest, da-da-da-da-da. But there's also this aspect of the unknown and the supernatural that we can't quite articulate. And so we're going to put this there. And if we're ever not sure what we need to do to keep the gods happy, or kind of if there's something not explained by our theological structure that we've put around things, we're going to offer some sacrifices here. And Paul's saying, this God who you unknowingly worship, this is who the true God is. This is the God I'm about to tell you about, and I'm going to help you understand that, in fact, he's really not an unknown or unknowable God at all, but he's been revealed in Jesus. And you might think, well, Tom, I'm really not with you here. Like, we don't do idol worship anymore. We don't do statues. We don't do public offerings and things like that. But I'd just say, I think things like this are all around us. And they come in different shapes and sizes. Take, for example, the famous spiritualist church in Totton. If Paul came to Totton, he might start by saying something very similar to us. People of Totton, I see that you're very religious. You have many churches. Should be important to do that. I notice you. Why does Totton have a spiritualist church? Well, it's because there are so many people who recognize there's something beyond the physical. There's something beyond the tangible things that we can touch and see and feel with our hands. And so they've built this kind of quite strange structure around it. And that happens all the time because we live in a culture that says, no, come on, rational people. This is all that's here. It's just the physical stuff. There's nothing, you're just kidding yourself. You just want to feel better about yourself if you think there's something, a force or a mysterious thing out there that's trying to help you through life. But people don't buy that anymore, particularly post-COVID. Like, the atheists have had their little moment in the sun, and actually a lot of people have gone, yeah, but that just doesn't add up. Like, there has to be something more than just the flesh and bones, the atoms and the molecules, because we're wired to know that there's something more than that. But the spiritualist church is there because people are going, okay, well, if there's something more, then maybe we can feel it out together, and maybe all we need to do is kind of get a medium in or a psychic in, and we can do some cool tricks, and maybe we can make a bit of money as we do it, but that's not for me to judge. But why is it a church? Why is it not just the spiritualist club or the spiritualist house or whatever? Well, it's because deep down we know that we're looking not just for a club to be a part of or a movement to be a part of, but we're looking for true and deep meaning. And so the culture is borrowing our language. It's taking our stuff and trying to twist it and distort it and say, oh yeah, don't worry, what you really need is not that Christianity rubbish. That's ancient history now. We don't need that. Come to the spiritualist church where we can connect with the universe. And, I'm preaching to the converted, literally, as I'm saying this, but that's like the altar to the unknown God. It's like people saying, oh, I want this life without Jesus. I want this life without God, but I can't quite do it completely, so I might go to the spiritualist church just to make me feel. I was stood behind someone in the queue to get into school with Leah the other day, and this guy was a cool-looking geezer. He had tattoos everywhere. He was wearing a trendy tracksuit. I kind of wanted to be his friend a little bit, and he was chatting to someone else, and he said, "Oh, I went with. You won't believe this, mate. I went with." He was talking to his friend. My missus took me to this yoga thing the other day, and he went, "I'm not spiritual at all, but for some reason I went." Like, the people in our society are crying out. Like, if there are blokes who are into lads going to yoga classes with their missus, like, we can invite our friends to church. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's a spiritual hunger in people, and that altar, he's going, like, for him, the altar to the unknown God is his yoga class. He's going like, I think it's stupid, but I might go, because there's something in me, and there's something in all of us that's curious about something more, and something beyond what we're just told to experience or buy into. Another example of an altar to the unknown God is, like, anyone see in the news over the last week or so, they've reopened the Notre Dame Cathedral. It's just a hilarious room of people at that reopening ceremony yesterday. Like, if you thought, how many people could you get in church that you didn't think you'd get in church? Like France, this famous, like, revolutionary, I don't need God, we can do our own thing, revolution, get rid of the establishment nation, spends millions and millions and millions of pounds to rebuild a cathedral. You'd think when the fire happened, you'd think a nation like that would go, let's bulldoze it and put some nice, put something arty-farty in there or something like, put something very French there. Sorry to the French people. My friend Emma would kill me for saying that. But let's do something creative. Let's do something, that shows our independence and that we don't need God. But what do? Oh my goodness, this is so important. We can't be without this. We went on holiday to Madrid for my birthday, and similarly they have this amazing cathedral in the middle of Madrid that they've just built. It's where the King and Queen of Spain just got married not that long ago, and it looks like an old building. It's actually quite new. But you walk through buildings like that, and you see this, you get into the main room, and it's silent. There's thousands of people in there, and they're all dropping money and things. But what do people most often do? They wander in, really quiet, and I just say a prayer. Just say a prayer. Why do people do that? Why not just wander through? Actually, it's often the real Christians who don't wander through and pray a prayer in that kind of environment. But like, they wander through. Why? What about that grand building? What about the stained glass windows and a moment of silence and a pause to think about what's really going on in life? Why do people default to prayer? It's because they know that's what they're made to do. They just haven't quite joined the dots. You could take the most irreligious person to a place like that and they, 8 times out of 10 would probably drop on their knees and say a prayer. It's odd, but again, it's these things, like we're not prepared to let the cathedrals go. We're not prepared to let this history go, despite the fact that people are saying, oh no, but we don't need God. It's like, but do you really mean that? Do you really mean that? Glenn Scrivener, who's a guy who's come and preached at KCC a few times, he's just written a great book on this called The Air We Breathe. And he just explains how like the modern values that we build our lives on of freedom, kindness, progress, and equality, these things that we hold up in Western secular culture and say these things really matter, these things are really important. He says they matter precisely because they're all rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet somehow as Christians, we get portrayed as the enemies of those things rather than as their biggest proponents and their biggest fans and their biggest advocates. I've just lent that book to my dad's partner, hoping that kicks off some conversations. I did a bad job of explaining what the book was about to my dad, and it didn't quite go very well. But I'm just praying, like, God, would you show people this obvious thing, that this altar to the unknown God that we've got in our lives, where we say, I want God's stuff, but I don't want Him, would just come tumbling down, and people would realize, hey, we can't do that. We can't have His stuff and not have Him. We can't argue for freedom, for justice, for equality without recognizing that there's a God right at the heart of those arguments, fighting for those things in the way that He intended them to be portrayed and lived out. It might be this morning that you have an equivalent of this altar in your life. It might be you're on a journey with Jesus. It might be a cross you wear around your neck. It might be a prayer that you send up into the ether hoping for an answer. It might be a deep desire for justice in your heart that you know is right to pursue, but you're not quite sure why you know that. It feels like it's lacking an anchor in the eternal. Or if you're a Christian here, you might be surrounded by friends and family who, because of life circumstances, are becoming more and more aware that this altar exists in their life too. Our role, as Carol often prays on a Tuesday, is to be signposts. To say, I'm here to point to the uncomfortable, mysterious parts of life and show you how Christianity, how Jesus tells a bigger, better story of how actually these deep longings, this desire for true beauty, this heart for justice, this question behind modern spirituality where we're not content with the physical, all finds its place, all finds its togetherness in Jesus. It's because Jesus is on the throne that we can find our answers to these questions. People now are seeking and searching more than ever. And as God's people, we need to be ready to help guide people home. Just say, hey, this desire that you feel, I felt that once, and now it's satisfied in Jesus. That thing that makes you really angry, it makes me angry too. Do you know why? Because I believe in a God who cares. But secondly, idol worship isn't just something that happened, and not just idol worship to the unknown God, but when you get a bunch of curious people, or when you get a bunch of philosophical people, and they miss God, and they don't recognize that He's behind the altar to the unknown God, you get this fascinating blend, which is what we're living through today, right? Of hyper-spiritual people who have missed it, and who have made idols out of other stuff. And you might say, like Paul said, oh, you're very religious, or you seem to really be devoted to that habit or that thing. But they've just completely missed it. Like people who, and it's not wrong to love your family, but we make idols of family, don't we? And you see people lay their life down on the altar of family and say, this is what I'm living through my kids and their success. It's the dad on the touchline living through his son at the football game, isn't it? I'm going to sacrifice everything so that my son has the chance to be the next Cristiano Ronaldo. It's like, okay, but I think you've missed it. I think you've taken the throne of your life and put your son and his football career on it. Why? That's not because they're necessarily, bad-hearted people in that. It's just that they've missed it. It's because Jesus isn't on the throne. Other stuff creeps on. Bob Dylan said it like this: you've got to serve somebody. And we all do. Paul is troubled by all these idols around him. And that, as I said earlier, like as a Christian, you were saying no to all these other idols in the culture and yes to the one true living God. And that made you quite unpopular. So like when natural disaster would strike and the city would be almost completely destroyed by a flood or a storm or whatever, everyone in the town would go, well, who didn't pray to the storm god today? And always the answer was the Jews and the Christians, because they didn't pray, they prayed to the one true God. So everyone else is saying, I laid my stuff on the altar, I gave all the money, I kept those gods happy, and yet the storms come. It must be because you guys weren't praying. So they got persecuted a lot for that. But again, we can buy into this kind of, we think today, again, because we don't have the shrines, because we don't have the altars, because we don't have the wooden statues or anything like that, that we don't do idol worship, do we? That's not really part of our culture. And actually the challenge of Acts 17 is, absolutely it is. Tim Keller talks about 3 root idols in culture. He talks about money, sex, and power. And you've heard that talked about a lot. And really, you've got lots of surface idols. You've got lots of different things like your kid's football career or whatever else that sits on the surface. But actually underneath all of those things, often what you'll find is the root idol is either money, sex, or power, or some kind of combination of the 3. And in Paul's culture, that was mammon, that was for money, that was Aphrodite for sex, and that was Mars for power. And they had their Greek kind of faces on at that moment. And we know, of course, that they're false gods and they don't really exist. But what idol worship does is it takes those things, it takes what either is good and corrupts it, or it takes kind of part of God's creation and shifts it where he should be. It takes the created thing and makes it in the place of the creator. And so just really quickly, like money, sex, and power. Money is obviously the worship of material things, of wealth. And actually, what I love about Jesus in Matthew's gospel is that you get these moments where he's not afraid, Jesus isn't afraid of talking about money. He's not afraid of confronting people over their love of money. And so he says in Matthew 19, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And you think, oh dear, what qualifies me to be a rich man? Are we all rich in here because we're in England and most of us have got a nice home to live in and some heating we can put on and some food on the table? And probably the answer is yes. So, and Jesus' disciples say exactly the same. They say, what does that mean for us? How then can we be saved, Jesus? If it's impossible for rich people to enter the kingdom, which, again, if you haven't picked up what Jesus, camels going through the eyes of the needle is impossible. It doesn't work. It's not like it's really, it's not like if you put it on a special episode of Taskmaster, you'd eventually figure it out. It's like, no, impossible. Can't happen. Rich people can't get saved. And so the disciples say, well, hang on a minute, Jesus, like, what does that mean for all of us then? And Jesus said, well, with man, that's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And so even in that, he's taking, and then if you need to join the link even more, at the end of Matthew's gospel, when Jesus is being buried, we get introduced to Joseph, and we're introduced to him as Joseph the rich man. And often when people are named in the Bible, as I've said, that means they were a disciple, a follower of Jesus. The gospel writers aren't in the habit of naming random people. They often name followers of Jesus. And so we're introduced to Joseph, and he offers his tomb. So he's a rich man, and he's rich enough that he has his own tomb prepared for when he dies. But because he's a disciple of Jesus, he offers it up. And so we get that fulfillment, and Jesus is buried in his tomb. And so we get this thing of like, Jesus has said, it's impossible for rich men to come into the kingdom of God, but with God, all things are possible, and so even rich people can get saved. So the problem with the idol of money is not that you have it. It's not a problem to be rich. It's not a problem to be wealthy. The problem is our hearts. The problem is if we put our trust in our money, if we put our security in our money, are we believing that money will be the answer to some of our problems? Or are we putting Jesus on the throne and saying, here's my money. Actually, my money is your money. And I want to be a good steward. That's the difference between the idol of money and being a rich man. Obviously, the god of sex. I often use these opportunities to have a pop at the blokes, about porn and all that sort of stuff. But like, that's not a guy-only problem. Let's just put it out there for just to give the guys a break for a week. It's not got any problem. Maybe you're not on certain websites, but maybe you like a cheeky novel or a good show on Netflix with a bit of a steamy scene in it. I'll leave it with your conscience, but it's not just a guy problem. It can be all of us. Actually, in this culture, what we've done, again, as Jesus gets further and further away from the center of our culture, we put things like physical attraction at the center. And so you hear people say horrible things like, oh yeah, try before you buy, meaning, oh, make sure you're sexually compatible before you commit to marrying someone. It just sends us further and further away from how Jesus wants us to engage in relationships, which is a love of others before a love of self. It's your preference, God, not my preference. It's a self-sacrificial thing following in the example of Jesus. We've seen, especially over the course of the last 60, 70 years, the beautiful things of family and purity and self-sacrifice all die on the altar to Aphrodite, to the god of sex. And then finally we see power, the god of Mars. You don't need me, to remind you of the amount of war and violence and horrendous, collusions between some of these idols that happens as well. Like power and sex coming together in a horrible way right now with sexual violence towards women and particularly of children as well. You'd only have to be on BBC News for a couple of minutes to see the latest stabbing in a city centre or a gang war gone out of control. And the key with all these idols is, obviously they shouldn't be on the throne, but when we do put them on the throne, it's not like this kind of semi-controversial thing. Actually, with Jesus on the throne, Jesus brings us life and humanity. We become who we were always meant to be with Jesus on the throne. When other things sit on Jesus' throne, that immediately starts to dehumanize us and to pull us away from the kind of people that Jesus is wanting us to be. It's kind of like, and again, it's controversial bringing up Harry Potter in church, I know, but I'm going to do it anyway because I quite like the books. But in the Harry Potter books, you've got the main villain, Voldemort, and Voldemort is a murderer at heart. And when he murders people, he creates something called a Horcrux, which is for the Harry Potter nerds in the room. But really what that means is that when you murder, a part of your soul separates from yourself. It's like severing your soul, the very heart and essence of who you are. It's the most dehuman thing you can do to take the life of another. And J.K. Rowling didn't get that idea, on an inspired Thursday morning when she was writing Harry Potter one day. She's speaking to something that's true of us, that actually to take the life of another is the ultimate act of dehumanization. We are least like God when we're trying to take life rather than bring life. And what we do when we put money, sex, or power on the throne is we say, I say no to the life that God you've got for me, and I'm going to pull away from that. And actually as I do that, I become less human, I become less whole, I become less who Jesus would have me to be. But the good news is, and I've got 2 minutes to do this, the good news is that what Paul does is he argues with this culture and he helps them see these touch points and he helps them understand where they're at in the story. And then he brings the hope and the good news of Jesus straight in afterwards. He doesn't leave them in doom and gloom. He doesn't leave them in condemnation. But what does he encourage them to do? Come to Jesus, the true God who's been revealed in him, who exposes and overcomes all the idols that we worship. And he points us to whole and fulfilled life in worshipping him alone. That was the charge to Christians then. If you wanted to become a Christian, you turned from all the idols in your culture that your family had ever worshipped. You turned from all those things that might steal the throne. And you say, Jesus, I worship you alone. The true and living God, not made by human hands, but the creator of it all. And this morning we need a reminder that the God we all look for is found in Jesus. Just track with me quickly through that last part of Paul's speech from verse 22 to 34. Jesus is revealed as the creator, the one who makes it all. Behind everything that we try and put on the throne is the creator who belongs on the throne. He's the giver of life. Jesus has no needs of his own, but out of his all-sufficiency, he breathes life into us. He's over all nations. That's why the book of Acts is so important. Jesus is the fulfillment of the story of the people of God. but he also brings hope to the Gentiles and to the nations of the world. That's always been God's plan, as John Rears always helps us understand, right? We're blessed to be a blessing, and it's for everyone. It's for everyone, for all nations. And Jesus perfectly reveals the Father. I love that that's where that phrase comes from. In him we move and have our being. He is closer than a brother. We are his offspring. We're his children. There's this intimate relationship. It's not dehumanizing like idol worship is. It's relational. It's life-giving. And what does he ask of us? He asks for our repentance. He asks for us to turn, as I've just said, and worship the one true God, in whom our resurrection hope is found. And people know this. The people in your life who don't yet know Jesus know that they need Jesus. They might not be able to articulate it yet, but there is an altar to an unknown God in everyone's life. And the tricky thing with the gospel is we're not guaranteed results. We're given the truth, and we're asked to be obedient with the truth. And we're asked to share that truth with people. But as Paul experienced on numerous occasions in numerous places, the results vary. Some laugh and mock. And we need to be ready for that. Because God can use even the persecution that we might experience. And I use that word very lightly in our context, because it's very different in other parts of the world. Others ask for more questions. They want to know more. They want to, can I speak to you about this another time? It's the word of the Lord. But others follow. Others bow the knee and say, yeah, Jesus, I'm all in. I want to follow. And so again, this morning is another opportunity. You'll be grateful to know, I'm going to hand over to Emma in a sec. She's going to work out how we're going to deal with the kids. But Jesus wants our obedience this morning. Jesus wants our hearts all in on him. He wants us to get rid of any trace of idol worship or anything or anyone that might have the throne in our life. And he wants us to be obedient in going and sharing that hope with a culture that's in desperate, desperate need. Don't buy the lie from the enemy that everyone's just going to laugh in your face and no one really needs what you've got. Everyone needs what you've got. Whether it's on the tips of their tongue or whether they're a million miles away. Everyone knows it. Everyone needs it. Everyone needs the good news of Jesus. Shall we stand together?